Gene Hackman never forgave them. Then 21 years of silence said everything. The silence that explained everything. In 1977, a director did something almost no one in Hollywood had ever done to Gene Hackman. He wrote down the damage. Every argument, every explosion. Every day the set became a place where people kept their distance and waited for the storm to pass. The director kept careful notes for 9 weeks, then published them, while Hackman was still one of the biggest names in American film. Hackman read the diary, said the director was right. 2 Oscars, 80 films. One of the most respected actors of his generation. And to understand why that diary was accurate, you have to go back further than any film set. Back to a boy in Danville, Illinois. 13 years old, playing in the street while his father's car came rolling past. His father raised one hand from the window, one casual wave. The kind you give a neighbor you expect to see tomorrow morning. Then the car kept going. That was the whole goodbye. This is the story of 7 people who crossed paths with that wave, and what each one revealed about the man carrying it, including, at the very end, the people Gene Hackman loved most. The man the world thought it knew. Before we go further, you need to understand what Gene Hackman meant to American movies. Not because of awards, because of what he did on screen that no one else could replicate. Hackman never looked like a traditional leading man. He had the face of someone who had worked difficult jobs for a long time. He was not smooth or elegant, not built for the kind of close-up that turns men into icons. That was exactly why no one could replace him. In The French Connection in 1971, he played Popeye Doyle, a New York detective who did the wrong thing for what he believed were the right reasons, and looked you straight in the eye while doing it. That won him his first Oscar. In The Conversation in 1974, he played the surveillance expert so afraid of being known by anyone that privacy became a mental illness. He carried the entire film without direct explanation. In Unforgiven in 1992, he played a small-town sheriff who believed cruelty and order were the same instrument. Clint Eastwood cast him specifically because Hackman could make a man like that feel real instead of convenient. That won him a second Oscar. And in The Royal Tenenbaums in 2001, a film we will return to, he played a father who came back too late, expected forgiveness to be waiting for him, and had no real understanding of why it was not. Different films, different decades, but always the same emotional weather. Men who could not forgive. Men who could not forget. Men who won every confrontation and still walked out of the room looking like they had lost something essential. People called it acting. As you are about to find out, some of it was not. The first person, the wave. The first person Gene Hackman never forgave was his father. Danville, Illinois was not a dramatic place. A small Midwestern city where people knew each other's cars and could tell by which lights were on who was home. Gene Hackman grew up there on a normal street, with a father who was present just long enough for his absence to carry permanent weight. His father's name was Eugene Allen Hackman. He worked as a printer. The family had no particular history of disaster, just ordinary American life in the early 1940s. And then, one afternoon, without warning, it ended. Gene was 13 years old. He was outside playing with boys from the neighborhood when his father's car came down the street. His father raised one hand from the wheel and made a gesture. The casual kind. The kind that means nothing. The kind you make without thinking. Then the car turned the corner. Gene Hackman's father never came back. No argument to replay, no final words to carry, no dramatic exit that gave the moment a shape you could argue with. Just a hand. Hackman talked about it publicly across 5 decades, but it was a 2001 appearance on Inside the Actor's Studio, where you could see what 65 years of carrying that afternoon had actually done. James Lipton asked how old he was when his father left. Hackman said, "I was about 13. I was down the street playing with some guys, and he drove by and kind of waved, and that was it." He stopped, looked down, then said, "It's only been 65 years or so." The audience laughed. It sounded like a joke. It was not a joke. He told Vanity Fair in 2004, "It was a real adios. It was so precise. Maybe that's why I became an actor. I doubt I would have become so sensitive to human behavior if that hadn't happened. if I hadn't realized how much one small gesture can mean." That is the most carefully built sentence he ever said about his father. It turns the wound into a theory. It makes the abandonment professionally useful. But read it with different attention. Gene Hackman did not learn rage from a fist. He learned it from a hand raised casually through a car window. And that precision became the grammar of everything that followed. Leave before you are left. Keep distance before distance can be used against you. When someone dismisses you, not with cruelty, not even with intention, but with the effortless casualness of a wave from a moving car, remember the exact details. File them precisely. Never lose the sequence. Hackman said later that he had eventually made peace with his father before the man died. That sounds like resolution. It sounds like the story closed, but making peace with someone because time ran out is different from forgiving them. Hackman understood that difference better than almost anyone. He had been studying the gap between those two things for 60 years, because the wound from that afternoon kept producing the same results. Even when the man carrying it knew exactly what it was, the second person was not someone who abandoned him. It was an institution that told him twice that he had nothing worth developing. The second person, the door that never opened. 1953. The Pasadena Playhouse in California. Gene Hackman was 23. He had come out of the Marines, where he had lied about his age to enlist at 16 and served nearly 5 years. He had no training, no connections, no money. What he had was a fixed belief that acting was the only thing worth pursuing. The Pasadena Playhouse was one of the most respected theatrical training schools in the country. Getting in on the GI Bill felt like a door finally opening. He was dismissed after 3 months. Grade point average of 1.4. Before he left, faculty voted on which students were least likely to succeed. Hackman made that list. The other student on the list was Dustin Hoffman. Hackman moved to New York. He worked as a shoe salesman, a furniture mover. A doorman opening doors for people who did not look at him. No car worth mentioning, no apartment that cost anything, no plan except to keep moving in one direction. One afternoon, while working the door, a former Marine officer from his service years walked past and recognized him. The officer stopped, looked at Hackman standing there, and said, "Hackman, you're a sorry son of a bitch." Then walked on without stopping for a response. Two institutions had now looked at Gene Hackman directly and found nothing particularly worth keeping. His father, and now, Pasadena. Most people in that position find a way to convert the dismissal into motivation. They use the rejection as a reason to prove someone wrong. That is the version of this story people prefer. Hackman did something colder. He became an expert at what it felt like to be looked through. Pasadena did not teach Gene Hackman how to act. It taught him what it felt like to be invisible. And invisibility, in the right man, can become a very dangerous fuel. Years later, Hollywood would make the same mistake. It would look at Hackman, decide he was not the first choice, and then watch him win the highest award it could offer. But before that happened, there was a phone call. And Hackman was the last name on the list. The third person, the last name on the list. The third person was the director who gave Hackman the role of his life. After everyone else had already said no. When William Friedkin began casting The French Connection in 1970, Gene Hackman was not his first thought. Paul Newman was approached. Newman declined. Steve McQueen, not interested. Charles Bronson, no. Other names came and went. Hackman was eventually called. He knew where he stood on that list. In this industry, information like this travels through agents, assistants, and the conversations people have at the right restaurants. The actor himself is technically the last to be told officially. He is almost always the first to understand what it means. To be clear, this is not a story about Hackman hating Friedkin. That would be too simple, and it would not be accurate. Friedkin gave him the role. The film got made. The Oscar was real. The person Hackman never fully forgave here was not the director. It was the order of the list. What Hackman did with that knowledge was not what most people do. He did not make peace with it. He did not decide it no longer mattered once the film succeeded. He picked it up and carried it onto the set, and he aimed it at the only place it could produce something worth watching. The performance. Popeye Doyle is not a hero in any comfortable sense. He is a man so certain of his own rightness that he stops noticing what he breaks along the way. What the film requires is that the audience believe Doyle's relentlessness is not a mood he is in. It is the only mode he operates in. Hackman made that completely believable. The French Connection was released in 1971. In 1972, Gene Hackman won the Academy Award for Best Actor, the last name on the list. In a different version of this story, that is the turning point. The wound closes. The man finds some peace in the proof. Gene Hackman did not function that way. Success did not soften him. It confirmed something he had suspected since a car turned a corner in Illinois. That being right about your own worth does not mean the people around you will recognize it without being forced to. The anger was not gone. It had better lighting, and it was about to meet someone patient enough to write everything down. The fourth person. The day a director published his worst day, the fourth person was the man who wrote down what everyone else had only whispered. 1976, San Quentin State Prison, California. Stanley Kramer was directing a thriller called The Domino Principle. Hackman was the lead. They were filming inside one of the most secure prisons in the country, which turned out to be the least dangerous environment on the production. On the first day of location filming at San Quentin, a prison guard was stabbed by an inmate within 100 feet of the camera crew. In some ways, that was the easiest kind of violence to understand. For 9 weeks, Kramer and Hackman fought. Not the kind of creative disagreement that sometimes produces something better. The kind that leaves marks and changes nothing. Arguments about scenes, about authority, about a production both men could see was not working. Arguments that had the surface of professional conflict and the depth of something much older. Kramer kept a diary, not mental notes. A written record, organized week by week, describing what Hackman said and how each conflict unfolded. A detailed account of what it actually cost to direct a film when the person carrying it had decided, consciously or otherwise, to make each day difficult. The Domino Principle opened in March 1977. 1 month later, Kramer published portions of that diary in Los Angeles Magazine. Not decades later, when everyone involved had moved on. Not after Hackman's death, when no response was possible. While the film was still in theaters. While Hackman was still active and recognized and working. Hackman read it. He told the Los Angeles Times, "I have to say it was accurate, and he was probably right in his remarks about me." He also said, in the same conversation, about the film itself, "I was on the take the money and run bandwagon. I knew it, and I had to stop." Hold those 2 sentences still. This is the most important moment in the entire story. Not because it shows Hackman at his worst, because it shows him looking at his worst with complete clarity and saying so out loud. Most people, confronted publicly with a written account of their worst professional behavior, deny it, argue it, contact lawyers. Hackman said, "That is accurate." There is a kind of honesty in that which is worth recognizing. He was not managing a reputation. He was not performing humility. He looked at a published document describing his damage and agreed with it, and then continued working. That is the real point. He could name it. He could not stop it. The wave from Danville had built a pattern too deep to be fixed by recognition alone. Knowing what drives your behavior and being capable of changing it are entirely different problems. Hackman never confused them. He just had not found a way through the second one. Stanley Kramer published the cost of standing close to Gene Hackman's damage. Hackman agreed with the invoice. The next person on this list was not someone Hackman fought at all. It was someone he protected. And that showed a side of him that everything up to this point had kept completely hidden. The fifth person, the one he would not abandon. In 1977, Gene Hackman agreed to play Lex Luthor in Superman. This was not an obvious fit. Hackman worked with serious directors on material that required full attention. Superman was a cape film. The villain wore purple. Other actors at his professional standing passed on roles like this without much hesitation. He took it because of Richard Donner. Donner was the director, technically skilled, warm. The specific kind of collaborative that made difficult actors feel their best work was still available to them. He reached out to Hackman directly, made his case in person, and earned a commitment that Hackman did not give to many people quickly or easily. Hackman said later that he had done both Superman films entirely because of Donner. Without Donner, the conversation would have ended at the first contact. During production of the second film, the producers, Ilya and Alexander Salkind, removed Richard Donner. The stated reason was creative differences. What mattered to Hackman was simpler than any official explanation. The man who had earned his trust had been discarded by the people who owned the project. When it came time for Superman 3, Hackman's position was short. No, not a negotiation, not a request for better terms. The answer was no, and the reason was Donner. That was the complete explanation. Turning that down cost him an easy return to one of the biggest franchises in the world. Hackman calculated none of this. He was applying the same standard he had held since the years of doing difficult work in New York with nothing coming back. If you earn my trust, I stay. If you treat that trust as a line item, we are finished. The Salkinds were finished. Here is why this moment belongs in this story. The damage from Danville and Pasadena, and being last on Friedkin's list, had produced a man who was hard to work beside, and honest enough to know it. Those experiences produced anger, and the specific way that anger burned outward. This moment produced something different. It produced a man willing to take a real professional loss, because someone who had been straight with him had been treated unfairly. Gene Hackman could not forgive the people who dismissed him. He also could not leave the people who had not. Both things were true simultaneously. Together, they tell you more about him than any role he ever played. But the next person on this list did not dismiss him or betray him. He did something far more unsettling. He understood him. The sixth person, the mirror he could not look away from. The sixth man did not underestimate Gene Hackman. He made a worse mistake. He understood him. 2001. Wes Anderson was 32 years old and had made 2 films that found devoted audiences without becoming mainstream hits. He was known for precision, for a specific way of working, and for trusting actors to find their way to something unusual. He wrote the role of Royal Tenenbaums specifically for Gene Hackman. For most actors, this is the highest form of professional recognition. A director has studied your work carefully, thought seriously about what you are capable of, and concluded that this particular character can only exist in your specific hands. Hackman did not appear to receive it as a compliment. Royal Tenenbaum is charming in ways that cost the people around him everything. He is funny in a way that arrives like an elbow. He loves his children with something that functions more like a story he tells himself than an action he takes on their behalf. He returns to his family after years away and cannot understand why his presence alone is not enough. He causes damage while believing he is making repairs. He is, in other words, a man who has been absent from the people who needed him and has not fully grasped the weight of that. The filming was difficult from the first week. Cast members described a set that changed when Hackman arrived each morning. Gwyneth Paltrow said she was scared. Angelica Houston said she spent more of her attention protecting Anderson than on her own performance. Bill Murray, who had worked in enough difficult environments that Hackman's behavior registered more as weather than threat, was quietly asked by Anderson to position himself between them when things got tight. Hackman said things to Anderson that were not professional. Anderson later described being genuinely frightened during the production. The film was released at the end of 2001 to some of the best reviews of any American film that year. Now sit with the question. Gene Hackman had played hundreds of difficult, layered roles, without needing to make his director afraid to come to work. Why this one? Royal Tenenbaum is a father who missed his window with the people who needed him and spent years trying to work his way back through wit and performance rather than actual honesty. He believes in his own love for his family while making that love very difficult to receive. Hackman made him so real that people who had never thought about fatherhood in these terms left the theater feeling they had spent time with someone they recognized. Some performances require only technical skill. Some require recognition. 3 years after the Royal Tenenbaums, Gene Hackman announced his retirement from acting. He moved to Santa Fe with his wife Betsy. He stopped giving interviews. He did not appear at awards ceremonies. He made no farewell role, wrote no memoir, gave no speech. He stopped. No explanation offered. No door left open. The story, however, was not finished. Because the last person on this list was not a director, or a producer, or a casting decision. It was something that had been there from the beginning. The seventh person, The echo. The seventh name is the hardest because it does not follow the pattern. His father abandoned him. Pasadena dismissed him. Hollywood ranked him last. A director published a document describing his worst behavior. Producers discarded the one person who had earned his trust. A young filmmaker wrote a role that came too close to something real. Those are all wounds from outside. The seventh is not. Gene Hackman had 3 children from his first marriage: Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie. He was married to their mother for 30 years. The relationship with his children contained real warmth across decades. There were years that worked. There were also years that were elsewhere, on set, in different states, inside productions that demanded everything he had. Hackman acknowledged across different interviews in different decades that the distances had grown, that the relationship had not always been what it should have been, that there had been periods of separation that were not easily explained. What people close to the household noted in his final years in Santa Fe was something specific: a life organized around careful insulation. All outside communication passed through his wife Betsy. If you wanted to reach Gene Hackman, you went through Betsy first. His family, to reach him directly, navigated the same arrangement. This is not the story of a man who did not love his children. That would be too easy, and it would not be true. This is the story of a man who learned at 13 that love and presence are not the same thing, who spent 50 years studying that gap, who converted that understanding into performances that told audiences things about human distance they had not had language for, who acknowledged the cost when a director published it, who named it in public, a real adios, he said, so precise, with a careful suggestion that perhaps it made him a better actor. Distance appeared in his private life again, not as a single dramatic gesture, not as abandonment in the simple sense, but as the shape through which things quietly operated in the years before he died. And here is the part that makes this story complete. Gene Hackman did not set out to repeat his father. No one ever does. The pattern does not announce itself. It just reappears, in different forms, with different people, at different points in life, because the grammar written into you at 13 does not change unless something specific forces it to. There is a film he made in 1970 called I Never Sang for My Father. A son tries to reach an aging father before the window closes. Hackman said in interviews that he wished his mother had lived to see that performance. She had died before he ever worked professionally. He played a man trying to get through to a father who had no map for being reached. He may have understood that situation from both sides of the door. What 21 years said. In 2004, Gene Hackman stopped. No farewell role. No final interview where the edges softened for the cameras. No prepared statement. Just Santa Fe, a locked gate. And 21 years in which one of the most capable actors American film ever produced gave the industry almost nothing. His father had left with a wave. Pasadena said there was nothing worth training. Hollywood called him last, then called the ceremony that followed an Oscar. A director wrote down the damage and published it while Hackman was still working. Producers discarded the man who had earned his trust. A young filmmaker wrote a role that came too close, and the people nearest to him, the people who had not dismissed him, not ranked him last, not published anything about him, also found themselves on the far side of a distance that had no dramatic origin point. Gene Hackman spent his career playing men who carried old wounds like tools. Men who did the right thing with more force than necessary. Men who won every confrontation and still walked out of the room looking like they had lost something that mattered. That was not only craft, that was recognition. 21 years of silence did not protect Gene Hackman from anything, it explained him. He never forgave them. And maybe, in the end, that was the only language he trusted completely. Maybe the tragedy is that both answers can be true at the same time. Was Gene Hackman a man who could not escape what had been done to him, or a man who chose not to? Tell me what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you land on that one.